First AI Fringe in November of 23 took place against what feels now like a pretty different political backdrop to the one we currently have. Back then, we were very concerned about the risks of safety risks from advanced AI systems in a very sort of public way. We had an executive order from President Biden, of course, new UK and US AI safety institutes that signaled that alignment and control of frontier AI systems was really at the top of the political agenda. Since then, of course, in the past couple of months, we've had President Trump and Sam Altman jointly announcing massive supercompute clusters. We've had President Macron announcing billions in private funding for French AI startups. Closer to home, we've had the UK government's response to the AI Opportunities Action Plan, call to make the UK an AI superpower. So this next panel is going to focus a little bit on the intersection between these two imperatives, the sort of innovation and safety debate. And it's going to cover, I think, some pretty interesting questions. What constitutes genuine AI safety and alignment, not just superficial compliance? How can we build public trust in AI without hindering beneficial innovation? And also, how should AI policy keep up with rapidly changing capabilities to maximize those benefits of AI while also minimizing the harms? So to unpack that landscape at the frontier of AI and policy, we'll be joined in about 15 minutes by an expert panel that includes William Isaac, Sarah Gold, Tommy Shaffer-Shane, and Gavin Freeguard. But in the meantime, just to give us a sense of that shifting approach, please join me in welcoming Vincent Manancourt from Milltown Partners, who's going to be doing a quick fireside with Nitarshan Rajkumar, who co-founded the UK AI Safety Institute and is now a vice chair leading the development of the EU's AI Code of Practice. Please join me in welcoming them.
I need to sit closest to the lectern. Hey, welcome back. So I have the privilege of running this panel, 3 p.m., which I think is a bit of a tough ask. You know, the coffees are wearing off. Everyone's feeling pretty sleepy. So I've mixed it up a bit. I've got a 15-minute chat with Nitarshan here, and then we'll go into a panel. So Nitarshan, thanks so much for coming. I'm really happy you're here. I've been trying for months to get you to this summit, so now I have you here for 15 minutes. You've just come from Paris. Like, can you tell us how it was there? You know, we're hearing about the kind of zeitgeist in AI, moving from safety to the kind of opportunities of AI. What was it like on the ground?
Yeah, I think your perspective on the Paris summit will be very different based on if you come from a camp that thinks about like safety and ethics, or if you come from a camp that's thinking about like innovation and like the global south and open source. So people in the safety community, I think, are roundly condemning what's happened at the summit. And even Anthropic, I think today put out a statement from Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, saying that this was a missed opportunity and that like this can't be allowed to happen again. But if you have the sort of hat of maybe what I suspect Macron had, that this is about drumming up, support for French investment, 200 billion euros being invested in France for like data centers and AI startups, then this is like a huge success, right? That's an enormous amount of money that's going into France. So if you treat it as like an investment expo, this seems like a great success. If you treat this as like a moment for actual global coordination on AI safety, or just AI more broadly, which is what the previous two summits have been, then it's hard not to look at this with a lot of disappointment, I think. So.
And you were instrumental in setting up the UK AI Safety Institute. I'm always kind of wondering where you are. Sometimes you're in San Francisco, sometimes you're Canadian, sometimes you're in Cambridge, sometimes you're in Brussels. What have you been doing since leaving the UK government?
Yeah, so I'm part of the Code of Practice, which is a process that the European Union is putting together. So in the AI Act, it specifies for general purpose AI systems like ChatGPT or Claude or other systems. A regulatory framework for those need to be written. And they've delegated that to independent academic experts. And since I've left government, I'm now an academic, gone back to doing my PhD. So I have been spending the last few months helping put together that process along with other really fantastic people like Joshua Bengio, Maria Chishaka, and others from civil society and academia. And so we've put out multiple drafts of that. You might have seen that there's been public discourse from companies like Meta and Google saying that they might not be super happy about this publicly, the state that it's in right now. So it's a bit of a back and forth. And it's interesting running a multi-stakeholder process where you have thousands of people from across civil society and industry and academia, and it's not the most efficient way to make friends, I think. But I think we are putting something together that's going to ideally really put standards around safety. So there's been great work with Bletchley and Seoul, where we got companies to sign up to voluntary commitments, and this will be the first binding instance of regulation, kind of taking the next step, building on these voluntary commitments, building a lot on industry practices. I think we've drawn a lot of inspiration from the good work that industry has done, and in particular that American companies have done. So this is really a reflection of American standard setting, even in some form, but drawing upon a lot of what's necessary from the AI Act that we're being asked to do. So.
I mean, you have an interesting perspective then of having worked in the UK government, now working very closely with the EU institutions on this code of practice. How would you compare the two experiences?
Yeah, I'd say nothing has been standard. I guess the experience of creating the AI Safety Institute and the AI Summit, the AI Safety Summit, that was not business as usual. There was extreme political support from the Prime Minister at the time and the Secretary of State at the time. So sort of the stars had all aligned around just we want to make something happen, and it's going to become a legacy-defining moment, right? So the system moves when that sort of direction is given to it, even though it's not a political vote winner at all, right? So it was entirely we need to do this because it seems the right thing and because the Prime Minister really wants something good to happen here. So we were just able to do things that seemed really unusual for the civil service. We were able to recruit people to come from OpenAI and DeepMind to go into government, which sounds crazy, but now the UK government has people like that, of that caliber and that expertise. People that could choose to be going, making millions of dollars elsewhere in America, are instead coming to work for the British government, and that's a huge success. And I think with the EU, it's also quite a different system from usual. It's not Parliament writing new laws. They've delegated again to a set of about 10 experts, independent academic experts, to write the regulation on general purpose AI systems, including people that are not European, such as myself and Joshua Bengio. So it's it is quite diverse in that way. So it's not business as usual there either. But the EU is a very different bureaucracy. In some ways, all bureaucracies are maybe the same in some forms. But the EU is a very different bureaucracy. The British civil service, I think, when the political impetus is there, things happen very quickly. Whereas here, it's a long stakeholder-driven process. We need to keep industry on board as well. So I think those are some immediate points of comparison. And we're drafting regulation with what we're doing in the EU compared to in the UK. We were focused a lot on specific actions, do technical testing of AI systems. So therefore, we need to get technical people into government to do to write the code to actually do this sort of work. Or host and convene a bunch of people from around the world, right? To host a summit. So we weren't doing any regulation at all. So it's very, very different paths to influencing change on the global stage. But the UK market is maybe not big enough compared to the EU market. So I think there's different levers that they can pull. And the EU's 27 member states, so it's much harder for them to just build new institutions such as an AI Safety Institute that are central. So
how is it doing this kind of work in the political environment that we're currently in? J.D. Vance, the US Vice President this morning, said that the EU regulation was holding back AI and tech companies. How is it working on regulation in that kind of environment right now?
Yeah, and I think it's important for anyone that cares about AI to go listen to J.D. Vance's speech, because I think that is probably the strongest signal that we're going to get from the American administration for the foreseeable future around what their AI agenda is. I think they have 2 or 3 more months to write an AI action plan that was in an executive order. And he also started his speech, I think, by saying, I'm not here to talk about safety. I'm here to talk about opportunities. So there's been a complete vibe shift, not just in America, but in France as well, Macron drumming up 200 billion euros in support. And I think this is actually pretty fine. I think it's good that we are focusing on opportunities and how can we measurably improve people's lives. A lot of that work around safety and raising awareness of it, so we would take action. Right? And we created AI Safety Institutes. There's a network of those around the world now. People are aware of the risks that we're dealing with, so it's not nearly as neglected anymore. So we have institutions and mechanisms in place to address these risks and processes. So it's not just a one-off thing. So it's good that we're focusing more attention on opportunities now as well, I think. And with the regulation aspect, I think companies have pretty strong views on other aspects of regulation, like the Digital Services Act, GDPR. It's the work that we're doing in the Code of Practice. I think we're not at a place where companies are strongly opposing us right now. But we'll see in a few weeks. But I think the biggest concerns are really other pieces of regulation that are happening in the EU. And us as drafters, as chairs and vice chairs of this process, the code of practice, have really tried to balance out a lot of interests and again take a lot of inspiration from the good work that companies are doing on safety, taking lots of inspiration from the safety frameworks that they're already putting out. So we think it's a lot more collaborative compared to the way that regulation is maybe usually done in the EU.
And just quickly, because I don't think we have too much time left, but on AI safety right now, as an AI safety expert, where do you assess that we are right now? Do you think we're ready for the risks that might be coming?
Yeah, I think I can say a lot more because I'm an independent academic now. I think people are totally unprepared. Governments are totally unprepared. Companies are totally unprepared for the sort of enormous transformation that's going to occur. I think when company CEOs are saying, I think we'll be able to build systems that can do anything a human can do in the next 2 to 5 years, you shouldn't laugh at that. You should take it pretty seriously. It's equivalent to unlimited high-skilled immigration entering your country and the sort of effect that's going to have on you, right? And so that's not even just on the safety, how things could be misused side of things, but it's on the side of how will society just be enormously disrupted. And we see that when there's economic dislocation and disruption that social structures really fall apart, right, in pretty scary ways. So we should be kind of aware of those risks and not just be dismissive of them. And consistently, people have just been wrong over the last 10 years in terms of how rapidly progress is going to continue. And people keep saying there's a wall. There's never a wall. There's always sort of just things that we keep overcoming, and then it's so a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, right? That progress will continue without. And especially now we have trillions of dollars being invested into this. We should expect continued progress. So yeah, I guess just on the safety side of things as well, if we have systems that are capable of doing anything a human can, there's a lot of bad things that people already are out there doing or trying to do. And we should also be concerned about a world in which it's super easy for anyone to get access to this, right? What if anyone could build a nuclear weapon themselves? The security situation in the world would just be totally different. So these are things that we're going to be confronted by in the next 5 years that we're not prepared for.
Well, on that positive note, thank you, Nitarshan. It's been really good. Please give me a round of applause for Nitarshan.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
We'd love to welcome to the stage the panelists now. Yeah. Sorry, I thought you might have a chaperone, but you're going to have to do it yourselves. Great. Why don't I'll let you introduce yourselves briefly if possible. I think you'll do a much better job than I would. So starting with Sarah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah Gold. I'm the founder and CEO of Projects by If. We are a design and strategy firm based in the UK. We help organisations move faster with less risk by helping them design products and services that people can trust. That's me, Gavin.
Hi everyone, I'm Gavin Freeguard. I'm Special Advisor at the Open Data Institute, which is just across the way in King's Cross. We are a research and consultancy organisation which aims to make data work for everyone. You may also see me pop up at Connected by Data at the Institute for Government, Public Digital and elsewhere.
Hi everyone, I'm Tommy Shaffer Shane. I am a policy manager at the Centre for Long-Term Resilience. We're a think tank that's based in Westminster that is working to help the government introduce regulation and risk management to deal with some of the most extreme risks that we face as a society. I'm pleased to be here.
My name is William Isaac. I'm a principal scientist at DeepMind. I lead a research team that focuses on how we actually kind of advance safety and responsibility of our models and our systems. We kind of do have a kind of area of focus. We think a lot about how do we evaluate and understand the behavior of our systems to make sure and ensure the safety of them. And we also obviously explore areas like alignment. So how do we incorporate other communities and other stakeholders into the process of designing kind of safe systems? And so this kind of scope of research is kind of an area of focus for our team.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you all for coming and participating in this panel. William, I'd like to start with you. I feel like Google DeepMind's often, the star of the show at these events, and that's not just because it's a Milltown client. Yeah. I think, it's a big name. We're very lucky to have a leading AI lab in the UK, but I'm just quite interested to know what it is exactly you do within DeepMind, and I think it'd be interesting for the audience to know what you do.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm a research scientist, so not surprisingly, I spend a lot of time doing research. But I think a lot of the kind of research that we focus on is really trying to be forward-looking and thinking about what are the kind of anticipatory kind of risks and things that we see in our systems, and how do we do a good job of making sure that we're addressing them in a meaningful way. And obviously, my own kind of expertise and the team's expertise really does focus on areas kind of specifically. One is around evaluation, right? We think a lot about, how do we actually kind of translate some of the kind of risks that we see in the world into ways that we can actually kind of, have grounded measurement. And this is something that we've kind of really put a lot of emphasis on, because we believe that that's the best way to be able to make progress in both communicating to the public about what the kind of kind of scale and potential scope of impact might be, but also how we actually address it internally and be proactive about it. Mm-hmm. Another area is obviously kind of forms of alignment. And this is something that we've kind of written about extensively. Myself and many others were kind of on the early papers that DeepMind kind of wrote about how do we do things like RLHF or language models themselves. And a lot of that thinking was, how do we actually make sure that we design systems that work for everyone? And I think, how do we make sure that we incorporate the kind of broad range of stakeholders that will use AI systems into that process? And so it's something that we've kind of written extensively about, both as a team and also try to put it in practice.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, I'd be interested in your perspective. You're very much focused on, building trust in these systems, and I think you work with some of the leading labs. What for you are the kind of key ingredients to building trust in AI?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's an interesting part of the question that I'd just like to tap into, which is I'd say that we're not trying to build more trust in a way. What we're trying to do is create the conditions where people are able to exercise human judgment as to whether to trust or not, particularly when we're looking at generative AI systems that as part of how they work, they can create false positives, false negatives. We need to make sure that in the interfaces of the services that these technologies are applied to, that we create those moments where we let people ask, is this answer or suggestion that I'm being given worthy of my trust, based on the risk that I'm kind of applying it to. So I think this is partly how do we make sure that we build critical thinking into the way that the products and services are designed that use these kinds of technologies. However, I also think we really need to bring trustworthiness into these technologies. So how can these technologies demonstrate that they are worthy of our trust consistently? And that if over the last 9 years now of working across big tech, regulators, governments, regulated industries, startups, we see that there are 3 principles that you can embed into these technical systems. They won't be new to many of you: transparency, participation, and consent. So really, can we make sure that these technologies can be explained to people, that they are in use, how they work, what kind of information they use, that they are participatory. So how do we make sure that people can give feedback about what works well, what doesn't work well, but also that these systems can be more representative of the people for whom they're providing, as part of providing services. And also consentful, which for us is it's a journey. Consent isn't a once and done moment. It's how do we keep asking for permission, keep checking that that's okay. So for us, those kind of 3 characteristics can be designed and embedded within the kind of broader systems that we design and build products and services with. And I think it's those 3 key areas that we really need to be seeing demonstrable progress on. We talk a lot about transparency, for example, but we need to start building the kind of social and technical infrastructure that makes that really easy for governments to deliver against, but also private sector organisations too.
Mm-hmm. Gavin, on the question of trust, I know that the Open Data Institute is obviously very concerned and has an eye on one of the inputs of AI, which is data. And personally, having come to AI via data protection, it's something that I keep an eye on. Do you think there's been enough focus on data as an input in terms of building trust and safety in AI?
I think we've seen a growing focus on the importance of data as I think we call it the feedstock at the ODI. I think the AI Opportunities Action Plan calls it the lifeblood of AI. I think we've started to see people recognising that more, but there's probably still more that we could do. Some of my colleagues did some research at the end of last year which looked at the sort of global perspective on that and found that if you look at AI policies across the world, actually a lot in wealthier countries, particularly in Europe, they are starting to talk a lot more about data, whereas actually in the global south, in lower and middle income countries, that's perhaps not quite happening so much, and that does lead to a risk that we end up with another sort of global digital divide when it comes to thinking about issues around data. I think just to build on what Sarah was saying as well, I completely agree with transparency, participation, and consent as really important principles in all of this. Just to build on the transparency bit to start with, obviously because data is such an important part of building AI systems, that's also where a lot of the systemic risks can come in, so bias, gaps, people being excluded, lack of documentation, problems with data quality, problems with validating that data as well. So I think we need to see a lot more transparency around developing AI, deploying AI, monitoring AI as a first step, actually, which allows us to have some of those conversations where we can empower people to shape the future themselves and to inform them as to whether they want to take particular approaches to consent.
Tommy, there's obviously on the one hand, there's a question of what the companies do themselves in terms of kind of technical mitigations around this, but what role do you think governments have in building AI safety?
Well, I think the government in the UK has set out a commitment in its manifesto that it's going to do some kind of regulation around AI. And I think that that's important for cementing and kind of making more consistent the types of approaches that organizations like Google DeepMind are making, that you were kind of referring to, William, that we have a level playing field there, that all companies are kind of expected to take those measures in a kind of similar and consistent way, so that we reduce the likelihood that unsafe models are released to the UK public and more broadly than that can cause kind of significant harm. The government also needs to kind of know what's going on, and I think that kind of speaks to this transparency point. Transparency is important as a principle. It's also practically important that a government knows where risks are materializing and it has the capacity to act. I mean, on a very basic level, has the relationships with the different companies to talk to them when something maybe looks like it's going wrong. It can take certain kinds of actions. And then once it knows what's happening, it has, especially in the most kind of extreme scenarios, it has the ability to intervene and actually do something. People often talk about, in the government, you pull levers and you realize it's not attached to anything. And we need to make sure that the government does know what it's going to do in a crisis, is able to pull on levers that actually are able to do something, and has the foundation to kind of work with other nations on that and collaboratively and coordinate its action too. So it's about being able to kind of breed that consistency for safer models, know when things are going wrong, and then actually be able to do something to protect public interests and public safety if it does go wrong, which hopefully it won't, but it's our job to think about what if it does.
Yeah, and William, what work is going on at the moment at DeepMind to kind of think about the potential risks and to build mitigations?
I mean, I think there's kind of a wide range of kind of like both kind of processes and innovations that we think about. Obviously, when you're kind of on the cutting edge, I think a lot of our conversations are thinking about what's around the corner. So obviously, we've seen some really impressive advancements in kind of thinking models and other areas where that really does shift a lot of the kind of paradigms of like how we approach safety. And I think a lot of that will come up even more as we kind of move towards an agentic area where we have like systems that can take kind of many different steps away from the kind of initial kind of user request. And I think that will be kind of area that we want to be able to make sure that we have kind of a robust approach and thinking and communicating that externally. Yeah. We've done a little bit of this already. My colleagues and myself, we wrote a very long paper outlining kind of what the kind of risk would be for kind of advanced AI assistance, and we talked about kind of the kind of scope of impact that would have. And obviously, we're thinking about areas of like adversarial testing. So one of the things I found very interesting about this was that the concept of red teaming, when we started looking at this maybe about 2 years ago, was a very underspecified area. And especially with more capable systems, how do you do that effectively? And so this has been one area we've been trying to kind of improve our kind of techniques around, both in the ways in which humans do adversarial testing, and obviously are there opportunities to have AI systems kind of also kind of extend this ability to kind of aid and assist in adversarially testing systems, so we can communicate better what the kind of performance of these systems are when they're released. And so these are kind of areas that we've looked at. One area that I would say beyond this that I think we're really excited in is obviously like the domain of how we think about broader alignment. So there was one paper that we did, and this was a little bit earlier, but on the back of our kind of first language model, we were very interested in this idea of, we set a lot of rules to allow our system to kind of do reinforcement of the human feedback, which is a technique that allows, individuals to be able to set a set of parameters, and in the kind of model's responses will kind of try its best to try to kind of constrain itself based on those rules. But one of the things we realized was that obviously this was done in our organization. We did not engage in a broader stakeholder group to figure out what would the communities that are actually using these systems define as kind of like appropriate rules. And so one of the things that we did was actually talk to communities and help them kind of design a set of rules to how we should kind of guide our own systems. And that was really kind of insightful, because when we compared that rule set that came from communities with ones that we actually derived and what other labs derived, there was this kind of gap between like what kind of communities thought was safe versus how labs had internalized that safety. And I think that was a really fascinating project and very eye-opening to think about what does it mean to truly align systems to human kind of values and needs.
And Google DeepMind recently rolled out Gemini 2. What were the kind of differences in the process of the work that you did between those two rollouts? Yeah, so I mean, and for like Gemini 1.0, we wrote this kind of paper shortly after the release where we really talked about our kind of approach to thinking about kind of like safety evaluations. And I thought it was really kind of like important that we kind of wrote that piece. And this is kind of consisted of like both kind of like, teams like ours that kind of think about the research, but also teams who are kind of working very closely in the development of Gemini. And I think that was really important because we kind of, in the process of doing that kind of first model release, really thought a lot about what does the structure of safety evaluations look like? Because again, when we were doing this was kind of really tabula rasa about what does it mean to kind of set up an infrastructure for testing that was truly kind of safe and robust. And I mean, obviously, there's still obviously areas where we can improve upon this process, but some of the things that we talked about was like having assurance evaluations versus developmental evaluations. So developmental evaluations are obviously the evaluations that check you're doing as the model progresses, but assurance evals were held out testing that you do pre-deployment. So you have kind of confidence that you're not kind of like practicing for the test and like making a kind of very low bar for release. There's obviously how do you kind of grapple with obviously a range of different modalities in your testing. And so techniques like this kind of allowed us to kind of demonstrate our just general holistic approach to safety evaluations. And I think when we moved from Gemini 1 to 2, it was thinking about that, but obviously moving into a multimodal era where I think a lot of the testing that we were doing, had focus on some modalities, but really thinking about how do you evaluate systems across many modalities. And I think this is where kind of adversarial testing played a much bigger role. And I think in the kind of like summer, I think of this year, we kind of released our kind of red teaming paper. We talked about a lot of the different techniques we use to try to improve human red teaming to make it more equipped for an era of like much more kind of complex and advanced systems. So yeah, these are just examples of like work we've done in this space. Yeah. So we're hearing here about the kind of increasing capabilities, but also the kind of increasing work that labs like DeepMind are doing around safety. Tommy, on the kind of like global policy front, to reiterate a question I asked Nitarshan, what's your view of this, the change of the kind of zeitgeist on the global agenda here, from moving from Bletchley, which is very laser focused on safety, to the kind of the more like pushing the opportunities space which we're in now?
Yeah, well, Nitarshan mentioned a kind of vibe shift. I think that's definitely a good way of describing it. I think that I'm also thinking about it in terms of a kind of pendulum shift as well. So in 2023, we had Bletchley. There was a kind of big international consensus that safety was a really big, important issue for the global kind of policy agenda. And in Seoul, we had Frontier AI safety commitments that I think 16 or 17 companies signed up for. And they've been huge steps forward. I think since then we've seen the pendulum shift a bit away from that. I think there's been a lot of discussion, well, we've all seen, around growth and innovation. There's been some kind of potentially unhelpful and slightly artificial trade-offs between growth and safety or risk management. Trying to think seriously about safety and risk is about trying to take the right risks. It's not about taking no risks, and it's trying to do that in a kind of sustainable and resilient way. But that's kind of pushed, I think, a bit back on the safety agenda. And I think we're seeing kind of big global trends. It's not just across AI, but across lots of aspects of politics. And there are kind of race dynamics that are developing. Some companies are not necessarily implementing the same safety practices that they were in response to some of the models like DeepSeek that have been released. So I think for those reasons, the pendulum is shifting away from safety. But the reason why I'm kind of, I suppose, keen for the metaphor of a pendulum is it swings back, right? And I think what I'm hoping for is that, especially kind of this year, we'll see that kind of that pendulum shift back towards a bit of a safety conversation that's a bit more kind of sober and measured and practical, because the issues aren't going away, and as these models improve, we're going to be more and more exposed to these risks, and it's going to feel like a really clear and present issue again. But hopefully we'll be able to breach that kind of balance between this kind of swings that we've been having over the last couple of years.
Sarah, do you think the pendulum's going to swing back towards safety, and what's your view of the pendulum swinging in the first place?
Yeah, well, I'm going to introduce a whole new metaphor here of an iceberg, but when I think about practically how we interface with these kinds of technologies, they are in the kinds of products and services that we use every day. For example, mapping apps that you use, or fitness trackers. This is where these kinds of technologies actually get into our hands, we use them, and this is where some of these real risks are seen every day, that issues we already have with some technologies that don't even use these kinds of automated technologies underneath them. But I think that the way that we design and build those products and services today has been really about prioritizing ease of use or experiences that are really delightful. And so the water level on my metaphorical iceberg has been quite high, in that we only expose a tiny bit of how these services work, and the majority is hidden under that water layer. And the way that we incentivize product teams is to make sure that the way we design these services is delightful, it's easy, that there's very little friction. With AI, that is just fundamentally the wrong model. We can't use that anymore. We have to lower that water level of our iceberg to expose more about how these systems work, in order that we are able to trust them, that we have confidence that they work in our interest, and that they actually work well enough for everyone. So I think Tommy's right, the pendulum will swing, but it actually, I think for me, when we start to implement and build these products and services that use AI, we have to see fundamentally different ways of designing with them, so that they do work and they do create these outcomes that we want. And that's only possible when we lower this water level on our iceberg, so we can expose more about what's happening under the hood. So I think we'll be seeing, and I hope we'll be seeing, a new playbook really of how we design with these AI technologies and make them so that they can be more transparent, they can give people redress, they can be consentful, because right now, let's face it, we're still very much relying on terms and conditions, pop-ups that everyone hates. This is not going to be the way that we will interact with these systems moving forward. It just can't be, right? So,
One.
Oh, thank you.
You have a fan. Well, maybe they really like the iceberg.
Yes, thank you.
Gavin, I think it's funny, I feel like we went from a position in 2023 where you had these two camps, the kind of X-risk people and then the people who are kind of championing the near-term risks, like bias and discrimination. Given that you're someone who kind of focuses on the data, the inputs, how do we avoid some of those near-term risks, existing risks, I suppose, like bias and discrimination by kind of focusing on the data?
I think, first of all, it's worth saying one thing that I've definitely observed is that the people worrying about existential risk and everyday risk, I think, have come a lot closer together and recognise the importance that we need to think about AI regulation in the round, not just in terms of regulating in particular areas, but how those different things relate to one another, and that we sort of need both to build systems which are able to demonstrate trustworthiness. I think if we're looking specifically at how we can tackle some of those particular risks around mitigating bias, for instance, again, transparency is part of the answer around the data that goes into these models, the algorithms that are used and the outputs that we get. But it is also thinking more about that sort of empowerment and participatory governance space as well. What's been quite striking about the conversation so far is that a lot of things that can sometimes be used to put that false opposition between regulation and growth. So transparency, public involvement, public engagement, regulation itself, they're really useful to people building and deploying these systems and services as well, precisely because they allow you to see what's going on elsewhere. They help you understand what people want from these systems, what they're concerned about, what they think the risks are, how you can alleviate and mitigate some of those concerns. So that again, there is a false opposition there, which I think we need to be careful not to go into. When it comes to empowering people and sort of participation and involvement, that does need to happen on a sort of individual level, and there might be privacy-enhancing technologies which we can use that allow us to give consent in a slightly different way. But it's also about thinking community empowerment, community rights. A lot of the ways in which data is used about us now, even if it's our personal data, is about connecting all of that data up. And we can be subject to AI-driven decisions that use data about people that aren't about us, and we don't tend to have rights in a lot of those circumstances. I suppose the one final thing to say is, and I would say this coming from a civil society organisation or from several civil society organisations, is we need more support for civil society organisations to be able to fulfil some of those scrutiny roles, because you look at the executive order under Biden where I think $200 million was made available to support some of those organisations to scrutinise what was going on, but also we need researchers to have access to some of this data to be able to understand the risks. We might need to be able to campaign for and against some of these things as well, because some of these things are novel. We're still understanding how these systems might affect us in positive and negative ways. So transparency is really important underlying all of that, but we need to step beyond that into empowering people, organisations and communities.
William, within your work, I think you have a specialism which is kind of bias and discrimination. How can you tell us a little bit about how you approach those questions in the development of Gemini 2.0?
I mean, obviously, I think in general, you want to have technologies that are representative of kind of all groups and all communities. And I think, the way I tend to think about it, because I do think there is a kind of shift in just general technology. That these systems can really do a kind of such a wide range of things. So I really try to think about in terms of how do we engage communities and kind of how we actually kind of have that reflected in the systems. And I think the way we've kind of did that for at least some of the Gemini releases, thinking about adversarial testing, and when going back to the paper that we wrote on this topic, one of the things that was very interesting about this was thinking about what groups get involved in the testing of these systems. And so we tried to make sure we put a great deal of emphasis of trying to get a representative kind of grouping of people who were doing the adversarial testing. And as we were trying to test, in alignment with our policies, really trying to kind of think a lot about, how do we actually make sure that we're identifying kind of the appropriate edge cases to make sure we improve the responsiveness of our systems. And so I think there's ways in which we can think about the way in which we do and conduct our kind of testing to make sure that these systems are kind of actually kind of reflective of that. And I think that kind of source of innovation is a way that we actually can make sure that we have these systems that do kind of align to kind of the broad range of communities who actually use these systems in practice.
Yeah. I have a slightly different, or build on that, but perhaps slightly different I'd just like to add, which is that we also can't forget people in this as well, in that our services will be delivered partly through technology, but we will also be heavily reliant still on people, as we should do, because often people who have particular needs, they won't be met by a single service. We do rely on caseworkers, call centre staff to provide empathy and help, particularly when we have specific needs. And so I just wanted to add that there's a point at which we can't train technology to do all of that for us, and actually we shouldn't either. There'll be parts of this where we won't want automation to go, and we will want to speak to a human, and so we can't forget about that too. So I just wanted to add that point onto your piece there.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think humans still matter. I think they are incredibly important for making sure that like society as a whole has like the kind of impact that we want to see. And I would say maybe as kind of like a future-looking question, I definitely do think this kind of question of complementarity is actually really important. Like, where are kind of areas where like, people actually make the difference in terms of the positive outcomes we want to see, and where do AI systems actually provide a kind of positive benefit? I think that thinking about we tend to have a very binary view of whether it can be automated or whether it should be done by humans. But in practice, like with all technology, right, there's some space in between where we feel like we get the kind of maximum benefit for what we want as a society. And I feel like that is a conversation we should increasingly have, is like, what are these trade-offs? And I think that does kind of like elevate the dignity and the kind of, criticality of kind of people who have specialized skills having this impact. So very much agree with that.
We only have a few minutes left. I want to try and end on a positive note, if possible. Yeah. In a sentence, can you tell me something you're positive about in AI in the next year ahead? All of you.
I can start, which is that I don't think it's enough to build services so that they are just easy to use and delightful. They need to be trustworthy too, without losing that ambition of simplicity or delight. And I think that that's been true for a long while, but the generative AI wave we're on really brings this to the forefront of a lot of organizations' attention. So I'm hopeful that we'll start to see some of those new ways of designing services so that they are genuinely trustworthy, that will start to come to bear. That's what I'm looking forward to.
I feel like the conversation has evolved quite a lot over the last couple of years to become much more practical and focused on what people are actually doing or trying to do, rather than some of the sort of theoretical and conceptual bits and pieces. And we're starting to see, for instance, the UK government testing and learning, to use a particular phrase, with AI in government, and we're starting to find out more about that on the outside. Mm-hmm. So I think people are trying to go about things the right way, and hopefully that will continue.
I mean, I'm optimistic the conversation around AI safety is going to kind of mature this year. I think that we're going to get to a place where, these kind of pendulum shifts get us to somewhere sensible. And I think particularly around the kind of most extreme risks, where I think a lot of governments can get around a table and talk and agree. Mm-hmm. I'm really optimistic that this year will be when that happens. We might have a few months where we're kind of still wrestling it out, but I kind of hope that towards the end of this year we're getting to somewhere really sensible and productive.
Yeah, I think what's going to be interesting is that I think over the next kind of 24, 36 months, I think we're going to see kind of a kind of evolution in the kind of quality of these AI systems, where they'll truly be kind of approaching kind of generally intelligent systems. And I think, while I think a lot of the kind of prevailing narrative has been rather negative, I do think there is a kind of, optimism that underlies this about what does it mean for kind of human empowerment. I really do think in a few years' time, I think everyone will be using AI systems in ways that positively impact their lives. And I do think thinking about how do we balance the things that make us uniquely human and add value to the world versus where AI systems kind of really leverage this. And I would say a lot of the academic research that we've seen on this is that, when people are given the access to these types of systems, it significantly improves their capacity to be effective in their roles, and does have a positive impact in, how they kind of achieve and do more. And I would love to see what that means if we actually focus on that question of where it provides value in people's lives. I think if we get that question right, I do think a lot of the kind of optimistic narratives around AI will be fulfilled.
Well, we've had pendulums, we've had icebergs. I'm optimistic that we'll continue to find colourful metaphors for AI. Thank you so much.